Welcome to Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Real Men, Designed for Greatness, the program intended to assist men and ultimately families and communities to live out their call faithfully and courageously as they work to restore and revitalize and rebuild the culture. I'm John Sablan, and with me is my co-host, Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. And welcome to episode 4, which is called Roll Call, the Vocation to Manhood. Now, last episode, Deacon, we were talking about being made in God's image and likeness. And today we're going to get a little bit more deeper, specifically to our roll call as men, right? So how does this look in our lives lived out as true men of God, attempting to change what we've been talking about? We've been talking a lot about what men are not and what we are not, as we're seeing in the culture and society, and really live out our vocation faithfully and fervently to really bring to the world and to the culture the love of God and His mercy through our own witness in our vocation of manhood. Let's talk about, for a little bit, about what we aren't. You know, how did we get here? We mentioned this a little bit in the first episode about what we've experienced over the last 40, 50 years. Let's go there a little bit again today to kind of help us understand everything that we're not supposed to be and how we can get back to how God has designed us to be. So just, thoughts on this idea of aggressive feminism, this assault on manhood and fatherhood. I know you had brought up, the character that we often see men being played on TV. Immediately what comes to mind are, the Homer Simpsons of the world, right? 2.5 Men, right? Those type of TV series, sitcoms that portray men as buffoons, right? Who are just the epitome of what it means to not be a man, but ultimately just be disengaged, indifferent, just acquiescing to whatever the culture tells them. But just kind of thoughts on the idea of what man is being portrayed in the world and media today.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about the context of vocations, I think it's the intrinsic connection, right? Because obviously the word vocations comes from vocare, and Latin means to call, right? So God is calling, God is calling, God is seeking, God is searching, and look for us. And what we do when we respond as real men is to answer that call, to experience the love of God, and then to live that. But what's happening, God is calling and we ain't responding. That's the problem. God's calling us and we're not heeding that call. And so what happens when we don't do that, we get into hedonism, right? We get into the sensuality and the pleasures of the culture. I tell you, I get emails from all over the world from men who have heard talks, or have read my book, or experienced my men's study program, whatever it is. And I gotta tell you, the top 2 things that I get from men are pornography, dealing with sexuality issues, or I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with my life. And isn't it interesting? Talk about vocations, right? The call of man, but yet these are the 2 top things that I get in my emails. So there's a connection between when you lose that call of God, you start aligning yourself with your senses. You start aligning yourself with, this is how I feel, and so we're trying to find our identity. We talked about this a little bit in our feelings, our emotions, and our responses, and our instinct, and our reactions, without rooting that in anything. Pope Benedict XVI, when he talked about the meaning of love, Deus Caritas Est, right? It's his first encyclical, God is love. He talks about the 4 different types of love, but the 2 that he specifically talks about is eros, which is a sensual, physical kind of love, and agape, which is actually the word for love that Jesus uses mostly in the Gospels, which is a self-giving, self-sacrificing love. And the Holy Father talks about eros and agape are meant to be together because it's a physical, sensual love. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's rooted within a love that gives itself away. But when you separate those 2, you separate love and life, you separate intimacy and communion, it creates a chasm within us, with a gap. And as human beings, we're not comfortable with that. And so we have to fill it with stuff. We try to fill it with drugs or alcohol, or as men, because we're visual, physical, tactile kinds of beings, the way we receive information, we fill it with images, pornography, or contraception, or work. We immerse ourselves in work, and we lose ourselves in that, and we think, look how important this is. So we start to fill it with these other things. And what we need to do is take a step back and start really learning to listen to God's voice. And if listening to God's voice, we begin to find ourselves, we begin to find our way. We start to go back to the biblical understandings we talked about, what it means to be made in the image likeness of God, to really serve, protect, and defend, our families, our church, and our culture.
Yeah, you bring up this idea again. We're talking about vocation. So now the vocation of manhood and how that translates into whatever our own personal vocations are, whether that be to religious life, whether that be to marriage, to consecrated single life, whatever that may be. But how most people approach it with a vacation mentality, right? That, hey, I'm looking to leave, not respond. I'm looking to enjoy myself, or whatever that may be, seeking out happiness in the pleasure principle, if you will, as a vacation mentality rather than a vocation, really to heed and answer God's call to what it is that he desires for us. And he knows, right? He knows exactly what we need as far as what's going to make us the most happy, right? And obviously in our own brokenness and our own woundedness, we think we know better. Mm-hmm. And we sometimes even project onto God what we will, not what he wills, right? So we often try to seek his will, and really what we're saying is, well, I will this, and I want to look for the signs that God has given me if it pertains to what I want in this specific vocation.
Yeah, and I think that outlines part of the problem. So instead of being made in the image and likeness of God, we're trying to make God into our own image and likeness, And so when that happens, God doesn't become your ultimate end. You talked about the beatific vision, right? Which means just living in the presence of God face to face forever, So that doesn't become our ultimate end, our ultimate meaning, our ultimate purpose. What Satan does, he takes pleasure, which is not a bad thing. I mean, if we were to go to Chicago, right? You got to get deep dish pizza. You come to Chicago. You can't go to Chicago and get no deep dish pizza. It's gonna be you bite into it, it's like, oh man, that's good. So I mean, God gave us things to enjoy. I think in human sexuality, I think that's pleasurable because God wants us to experience on a physical level the pleasure in a sense. I mean, it's an anthropomorphic image, right? But what he experiences the joy when he creates us. And when we participate in his ability to give new life, that's a pleasurable activity because it comes from God. What Satan does, the liar, he takes pleasure out of its proper context, knowing how we men are, takes pleasure out of its proper context of being a means toward our ultimate end, and he takes pleasure and he holds it up in the culture. Pleasure is now an end in itself. Pleasure is now your God. That's the problem. And so this idea of vocation is a calling and a listening and a responding, bringing us back to our true call and our true nature and our true selves as men rooted in the love of God,
exactly.
Not the love of self.
That's exactly. This idea of being called to communion with Christ, right? We see it, Catechism, paragraph 521. Christ enables us to live in him all that he himself lived, and he lives it in us. By his incarnation, he, the Son of God, has in a certain way united himself with each man. We are called only to become one with him, for he enables us as the members of his body to share in what he lived for us in his flesh as our mode, right? So Christ uniting himself to us through the incarnation, enabling us so that we can live in him, right? In him, through him, and with him. This idea of truly becoming Christ. We've been talking about this throughout the episode, right? That I've been crucified with Christ, right? It is no longer I, but Christ who lives in me. This idea of being called to communion, right? So it really, for us in this idea of vocation, right? So this discernment aspect, okay, you guys have been talking about Catholic masculinity, helping me try to understand that my value, my identity, my purpose, and my self-worth resides in God, and the fact that I am a child of God. Now, let's take that a step further. Okay, how does that, for us, help us understand God's calling in our life?
Okay. Well, first thing I want to make a comment on is the Catechism quote that you reminds me of 1 John 4:16. Now, this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible, 1 John chapter 4, verse 16. Because when I go to adoration, this is one of the things that I meditate on as I begin my adoration time. It says, God is love, And he who lives in love lives in God, and God lives in him. Think about that for a second. The God that created the universe, stars, planets, galaxies, quarks, neutrinos, all this different stuff in the universe, loves me enough to literally place his life in me. And as a response to that gift, I make a gift of my life back to God. Because you know how the Bible says, bless God. Bless God, like the Psalms, bless God when you do this. How can we bless God?
Yeah.
God's the one, how can we bless? We're just creatures. Yeah, but when we respond out of that love for God, we make a gift of ourselves to others. We respond to the call that God has given us to be true men that he created and calls us to be. That's how we're blessing God. That's how we're honoring God. That's how we're loving God. And the key is to listen to that voice and to respond. So, again, the emails that I get, well, what am I supposed to do with my life? What's God calling me to? That's a natural, normal place for many of us to be. I've been there a couple times. I used to live in a monastery, and obviously I ain't no monastery no more. How did that happen? What happened? And when I left the monastery, I had planned to go back. So it wasn't like I left thinking, oh, monastic life is not for me. I left because my mother got sick and almost died. I had to take care of my mother and my sister. And I was planning on going back when my mother recovered and she convalesced. During that time, I went to a wedding and met the woman who would be my wife. So I'm like, gee, what is this about now, And so there's particular times and particular moments in our life where God, but you have to learn to listen to that voice though. Because there's the voice of the culture, there's the voice of your ego, there's the voice of maybe your parents telling you what you should be doing with your life, and all these things are coming from the outside, but it's that voice of God. And how you listen to that voice, you have to be quiet. You have to really listen. Be still. Psalm 46 verse 11 says, be still and know that I am God. And I think it's that stillness and that silence and that quiet where we make ourselves vulnerable as men before God. And maybe we talked about this before. Vulnerability is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. I remember when my best friend died, I cried in my wife's arms. Craig and I have been friends since 4th grade. Literally, we were more like brothers than friends. He was the best man at my wedding. I was the best man at his wedding, and he died at 38 years old of cancer. Like literally within a week of diagnosis, he was dead. And it was a complete shock. I was angry at God. I'm not gonna lie. I was angry with God. I didn't understand what God was doing. How could he take my friend at 38 years old? He has 2 very small children, one of them under 1 year old. What are they supposed to do now? His wife didn't work. He was the one that provided. What are they supposed to do now? What kind of God? What are you doing? And I found it struggling to pray. I found it hard to. I was praying the office, but I was just I was reading words. I felt nothing. I felt dead. I felt empty. How do you come back from that, Yeah. But again, for me, it was about being vulnerable before God, recognizing that God's ways are not our ways. I don't always have to understand, but I have to trust him. Yeah. And so what came to me in adoration during this very painful time was, Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I trust you. Jesus, I give my life to you. So even at times now when I don't know what to say and I'm not sure what God might be doing, Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I trust you. Jesus, I give my life to you. And when we live that as men, that's how we begin to bless God.
God became man so that man could become God. Right, and of course,
small g.
Small g, yeah, exactly. Let's clarify. Let's clarify that right. Because men might run with that, right? Right. No, it's a small g in the sense of being made. Again, going back to being made in His image and likeness. Going back to how do we bless God by answering His call and fulfilling the purpose that He has determined in each and every one of our lives. Because each of us have a page and a chapter to write in this story of salvation, right? And so you obviously have a call that is going to. Even if there's similar calls, it's still going to be different because it's Deacon Harold's call, not John's call, that only you can respond to, fully in the way that God intends for, his work to be done here on this earth. One of the things that I think about in my own walk, in my own journey, because, we'll talk about this in the next episode in A Father's Love, specific about that, the impact our fathers have had in our lives and male role models. Part of what is at the depths of, I know, our calling to preach and to evangelize the hearts of men is because we see the need for us men to step up and to hear God's call and to respond to it because of the criticality and the impact that we have. I know for me personally that I've had, I was misled a lot of the time, right? And thought I had a calling from an earthly perspective, right? And got caught up in the external things. And I've never felt so fulfilled in my life, right? Than being here sitting with you, talking about faith and talking about the importance of God and to find peace in the simple saying of that I am a child of God and that I'm made in his image and likeness. But, let's talk some about the idea of vocation and that idea of silence and discernment, right? You got to be able to hear and listen and heed God. And obviously, especially for us as men, there's a lot of distractions out there. Right, we're probably more distracted from an external perspective than women are, and I think Archbishop Fulton Sheen had said something to the extent of, Adam was made from the earth, from the dust, right, and so we become from that very moment of how we were made, we're more concerned about the externals, where Eve was made from within Adam, right, and so she by design is much more internal. And so it totally resonates with me in the sense of, we get caught up with some of the external things. That's why, if you think about the two things that you're getting inquiries about or emails about, one being, what am I going to do with my life, right? That idea of vocation, that idea of, providing for one's family, right? Why do men struggle when they're unemployed? Because, not only is it part of the dignity of the human person to work and to provide, but as a man, there's something to be said about serving, protecting, and defending your family, or even just defending something, someone, right, or some cause. And it's like we are that warrior mentality that we rise up to that challenge. But maybe talk about some of your experience, some of the wisdom on vocation of finding God's call and what this has mean for us as men.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been several times in my life where I had to really discern. One was going back to the monastery. One was getting married. And one was obviously then being ordained a deacon. Mm-hmm. But the one I think I want to talk about is the transition from leaving my secular job to speaking and writing full time. Mm-hmm. Because I was in campus law enforcement. I was president of the Western Association of Campus Law Enforcement Administrators. After 9/11, I received specialized training in violence risk and threat assessment. Mm-hmm. So I was teaching at the police academy. I was teaching contemporary threat assessment methodology. So in other words, I was teaching police officers and first responders how to identify and respond to threats of terrorism. I got so good at it that I started a consulting company. And I would go into school districts, private corporations, colleges, universities to do what's called target hardening. Mm-hmm. I would help them become harder targets of violence and terrorism. And I was getting paid a lot of money to do that. It's very specialized work, very detailed work, and I was well compensated for what I did. And between that and my job as chief, things were going well. But then after I was ordained, I got a couple invitations to do some speaking, and that led to an appearance on Catholic radio, which led to an appearance on Catholic television, and then requests to start speaking. And I was kind of doing that on the side. It was my hobby, because I had my main job. That's right. But I still got my God thing going. I'm still doing the stuff on the side, speaking every now and then. But then over the years, it kept growing, and I wasn't even trying. I wasn't doing any marketing. I wasn't trying to get speaking engagements. It kept growing and growing and growing to the point where I said, I wonder if God is trying to say something to me over here. Nah, he couldn't possibly ask me to leave this to do that. Mm-hmm. And my boss at the time was a parishioner of my parish, very supportive. Then God, and I ignored God's voice, which we do. Let's be clear. Yeah. We're weak. We're sometimes scared. Sometimes we want to rely on the things that we know, mm-hmm. and instead of relying on knowing God, we rely on things that we know intellectually. So intellectually, I knew that this job can pay my mortgage. Mm-hmm. This job can keep my kids in Catholic school. Mm-hmm. That probably not. So I ignored it. So God nudged me a little bit. My boss became ill and had to retire early. And his replacement didn't see things quite the way that my boss saw them. And so I knew that I had an issue. And it came down to, is God calling me to do this, or should I stay? Should I try to balance both? And so I started going to adoration. Well, I mean, I've been going to adoration, but I increased my adoration time. And after 8 months, I knew that God was calling me. And here's how I knew. It wasn't, I was thinking, am I doing this because I want to do it? Mm-hmm. Well, clearly not, because I didn't think it could help to maintain my family. Am I doing this because they want me to do it? What is God saying here? But I got a sense of peace. I got a sense of joy, not happiness, but in this internal joy, like the joy in doing what you know God has asked you to do. And sometimes that comes from the fact that it's not what you want to do, because you'd rather do something else, but God is calling you to do something different, and you have to trust what God is leading you to. And that's what it became for me. And then I had it confirmed by talking to really close friends of mine who all said, without even talking to each other, they all said, oh yeah, you need to leave and start doing this other thing. And then finally it was confirmed by my wife. It was really her love and her support that gave me the courage to do God's will. Because remember, they're Conegdo, battle partners, we're in this together. Her love gave me the courage to follow God's will. And so I left the job and started doing this full time. And it was a little scary to begin, I gotta tell you. You know, it was scary. But I trusted God, and now, several years later down the road now, I couldn't imagine my life any other way. And here's the best part. Not only am I able to take care of my family, my marriage got better since I left that job. My relationship with my kids got better since I left. And we didn't even ask for that. I didn't pray for that. I said, help me to take care of my family. And just like with Solomon, well, give me wisdom. God gave him wisdom and much more on top of it. Yeah. And that, I'm telling you, I've experienced that. I love my wife more now than the day I married her. Because now we had to struggle financially. We had to make some choices and cut some things out and do some things. But that experience brought us closer and our family closer together. It's like a roller coaster, woo, up and down. It's been an incredible ride. But when you trust God as a man and know that, you're providing for your family because God has provided for you, and you're returning the blessing by honoring God, by doing his will, serving, protecting, defending, standing up to the culture, God is going to bless that.
So what I heard, Deacon, too, in this story, which is a great story and one that we often chat about, just as, not only do we help each other continue to discern God's will, but also as we help other people. But this idea of first taking it to prayer, right? Finding the time in sacred silence, obviously, ideally before the Blessed Sacrament, in Mass and through the sacraments as a whole, to be able to be as close to the source as possible as you're trying to discern his will. Which, you made that comment of oftentimes we want our will rather than God's, right? And so, I think of it as rather than the Trinity, we want the Trinity, right? Me, myself, and I, right? That's often where we really operate in rather than in the Trinity, God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But in sacred silence and prayer and adoration, the other is through a good circle of friends, right? Ones that are also trying to live out their call, their vocation, to help you discern whether or not this is something of God or of yourself or of the evil one, right? I mean, St. Ignatius would call that, right, discernment of spirits. It's real easy to choose between, your job was a good job, right? This opportunity is a good thing, but between good and evil, it's easy to dismiss the evil. Between good and good, how do I know what God's calling me to be able to see those two? So, prayer, sacred silence, the sacraments, good friends, a circle of friends, people that you can confide in to help you discern. And of course, because you're in the vocation of marriage, obviously you're a battle partner. You're a Conegdo. You're, the idea of that's a true one flesh union.
Yeah, let me just add this real quick about the adoration. Now, sometimes men, when I talk about adoration, I could pray anywhere. I could pray anywhere. I could pray in my room. I could pray in the car. I could pray while I'm walking. That's true. That's true. When I'm away, traveling, I can call my wife on the phone. It's good to talk to my wife, but it's always better to be with her. Yeah. Same thing with God. You can pray anywhere you want, but it's always better to be in the presence of the person that you love. Yeah. So, you can pray your car, but praying before Jesus. Sometimes my worry is my prayer. Sometimes if financially I'm worried about something, I'll go to adoration. Oh, man, Jesus, what am I going to do? You know, I got this, I got college tuition, I got this going on, I got this going on. And I'm going to worry anyway. Yeah. I might as well do it before Jesus.
Amen.
You know, I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm, you know, and that is my prayer. I don't have to do any formal rosary or this. You can. I'm not saying those things are wrong. Yeah. But sometimes your worry, sometimes your thoughts, sometimes just that's the vulnerability. That's the gift. Just being in the presence of God and just pouring yourself out to him like he did on the cross. Remember, we're living our spirituality as men from the cross. Right. He poured himself out, and we have to pour ourselves out as well.
Right, and just being in his presence is going to allow us to not only be blessed, but also to bless him, right, in that sense. So, Deacon, I appreciate you sharing your story there. You know, we talked about what it means to be a true man of God and how this, flows into our vocation as men. In our next episode, we're going to get a little bit more further down the road and talking about a father's love. You know, both you and I will have an opportunity to share our own stories about that relationship with our earthly fathers and how that impact our own relationship with our heavenly Father, and then also for us as men, right? The role that we play as fathers, perhaps, whether that's biologically or spiritually, we all have a role to play in that. So join us next time for A Father's Love as Deacon Harold and I take you further on in this journey of what it means to be real men designed for greatness. Thank you, and God bless.
Thanks for listening. We are blessed that you heard our episode. This podcast is available on all online platforms. You can follow us on our social media handles at Shalom World Podcast. We would love to hear from you. You are always welcome to email us at podcast@shalomworld.org. If you would like to support us, you can visit shalomworld.org/donate. To know more about our programs, kindly visit our website, shalomworld.org. We look forward to joining you on this podcast. May God bless you. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.